This is Banjo, and today I'll be going over the ramp start procedure for the MiG-29 in Falcon BMS. Inside the aircraft, the first step I'll do is to close the canopy. To do this, I'll pull the lever on the left side of the cockpit wall, which will close the canopy, and I can continue on with the startup procedure. Next, on the right wall, we have 4 selectable switches, being battery, main power, master fuel, and pump feed. We'll enable these. Then under the HUD, we'll set the parking brake. Note the amber light that comes on when the parking brake is set just above the emergency gear release. Next, on the back of the left console, we'll set the air source, at which point we'd start up the engine. On the right console, I'll left-click on Jet Fuel Start, which will start up the engine, as indicated by the lights that will come on the Warning Advisories panel, and the increase in RPM. At 20% RPM, I'll hit the idle cutoff, which is found in the middle of the left cockpit wall, which will allow the engine to continue finishing the startup procedure. As the RPM reaches normal idle levels, the engine gas temperature will increase to about 650 degrees, and power will be restored to the rest of the avionics. If you wish to conduct a lights test, you can find the button just underneath the parking brake, just above the switch for the radar altimeter. At this point, RPM is approaching 20%, which means I'll have to move over to the left cockpit wall and hit the idle cutoff to allow the engine to finish spooling up to normal idle level. At this point, I'll quickly go over where some of the avionics are located. Just under the radar scope, we can see we have a display. This is the data entry display as in the F-16, called the ECRAN in this aircraft. To the left, we have fuel quantities gauge, and below it, we have our radar altimeter. You see on the lower left, we have our HSI, above it, our ADI and speed located to the left. With engine start finished, the caution and advisory panel clears up. Next, I'll enable exterior lighting with the anti-collision and wingtip switches, the steady flash rotary, and the exterior lights power master rotary. Next, I'll move on to the avionics with the switches on the back of the right console. We have data link power, SMS and GPS power, right hardpoint, UFC, FCR, FCC, and left hardpoint power. At this point, I'll set my INS alignment into a line using the rotary locator just below the anti-collision light. Beginning the INS alignment, status will be displayed on the data entry display below the MFD. Just above this display, we have the power button to enable power to the MFD, with the brightness knob for the MFD located just to the left. The rotary just below the HUD will allow you to increase or decrease the brightness to the HUD, and we can see the align status located in the lower left of it, as well as the progress displayed on the DED and the FCR currently in its bit test. At this point, we can set our radio channel preset using the selector located on the back of the left console, and set the CNI toggle switch to UFC. Just beside this, we have rotaries for our auxiliary comm volumes, which will increase. Next, we'll set the radio functions and radio mode dials to our desired settings, which in this case I'm using both for radio mode and radio functions set to preset. To the left of this, we have 2 toggle switches, with the first being comms 1 in the forward and comms 2 in the lower position. On the left front quarter panel, on the lower section, we have a rotary to enable power to the helmet-mounted cueing system, and above this, we have our countermeasures panel. The 4 lower switches are RF, chaff, flare, and jammer power. Just above is the release program rotary, and above this is the release mode rotary. And to the right is the landing gear handle. In this example, I'm set up with semi as a release mode on program 1. At the top of this panel, we can see the weapons panel, with master arm on the upper left and ECM power at the top middle, laser arm below it with the master mode selector to the right, category selector to the left, and the button to the right of the master mode selector below the G meter is emergency jettison. Next, I'll set the radar altimeter into standby, located below the lights test button in the center of the cockpit below the parking brake. Next, we'll enable the voice message system by hitting the toggle switch just above the anti-collision toggle switch, and below the INS knob, we have a panel for TACAN, with the channel and band selector on the inner side and the TACAN mode selector on the outer side. Just beside the TACAN panel, there's a lever to enable power to the ejection seat, and as I do, it'll clear up the last remaining light on the caution advisories panel. Nav modes are on these orange push buttons with Nav on 1, Nav ILS on 2. On the lower row, we have TACAN on 1 and TACAN ILS on 2. To enable the radar warning receiver, hit the toggle switch on the lower row and push the push button above it to set it on. It's based off of a Western radar warning receiver rather than an SPO-15 should, so the threat indicator types on the lower row are settings with priority, handoff, target separation, naval, unknown, and search, in that order. At this point, I've got about a minute left on INS alignment, and the FCR bit test is about to wrap up. And in BMS, the radar scope functions as a full-on MFD, so once the bit test is finished, I'll enter the data transfer page and load the data transfer cartridge. Once I have the data transfer cartridge loaded, I'll have my comms preset information loaded as well, at which point I can move over to the forward toggle switch beside the radio panel to select comms 1, at which point I can verify that the frequency is indeed the correct frequency. Next I'll glance over at the DED and I can see preset 15 with correct frequency. We're able to see that the UFC functions, including the data command switch, are located directly below the data entry display. So at this point I'll simply hit list 6 to return to INS so I can check the status of the INS alignment. At this point, while I wait on INS alignment, I'll go over a few more avionics. Below the radar altimeter switch we can see our chaff and flare reserve. Currently 30 chaff, 30 flare. The autopilot panel can be located below the countermeasures panel, which will consist of the steer point hold, altitude hold, attitude hold, as well as off push buttons. At this point, INS alignment is completed, as indicated in the lower section of the HUD and on the data entry display, so we'll set the INS selector into nav mode. At this point, I'll bring the radar out of standby by selecting standby on the upper row and selecting the desired mode of operation, which in this case I'm using CRM. I'll enable nose wheel steering by pressing the TWS missile step. You can see it indicated on the caution advisories panel and on the gear and flaps panel. At this point I can release the parking brake or release it automatically when I throttle up to about 80%. So I call the tower, have them release the chocks, and call for taxi.
Taxi, runway 08. Hold short.